On March 18, 1839, a Chinese official stood on a beach in the port city of Human and watched as workers poured 20,000 chests of opium into massive trenches dug into the sand. The drug had a street value of roughly 9 million pounds sterling. That's more than $1 billion in today's money. For 23 days, the workers crushed the sticky black paste, mixed it with lime and salt, and flushed it into the sea. The man who ordered this destruction was Commissioner Lin Zexu, and he believed he was saving his nation from collapse. He had no idea he had just signed the death warrant for Chinese sovereignty. We're told the Opium Wars were about pride, about clashing civilizations, about the stubborn refusal of an ancient empire to modernize. That's the story you'll find in textbooks, but that story is a lie. The Opium Wars were not a clash of cultures. They were a bankruptcy operation. They were the violent collection of a debt that had never been agreed to. And the entity doing the collecting was not just the British military. It was the largest narco-trafficking cartel in human history, and it was run by a queen. The British Empire in the early 19th century looked like the most powerful force on earth. Its navy patrolled every ocean. Its factories churned out steel and textiles faster than any competitor. London was the financial capital of the world, and the Union Jack flew over territories on every continent. The sun never set on British soil. Poets wrote odes to its glory. Painters immortalized its monarchs. Children in British schools learned that their nation was chosen by God to civilize the savage world. But beneath the marble floors of Parliament and the gilded halls of Windsor Castle, the Empire's accountants were staring at a ledger that told a very different story. The British Empire was bleeding silver. It was hemorrhaging wealth at a rate that threatened to drain the Bank of England dry. And the cause of this financial wound was not a war or a famine. It was tea. By the 1830s, tea had become more than a beverage in Britain. It was the fuel that powered the Industrial Revolution. Factory workers drank it to survive 14-hour shifts in the mills. Aristocrats served it at every social gathering. The British government collected millions in tax revenue from tea imports. The problem was simple and catastrophic. Tea only grew in China, and the Qing emperor who ruled from Beijing had zero interest in British goods. He didn't want wool because his people wore silk. He didn't want clocks because Chinese astronomers had been tracking celestial movements for millennia. The emperor would only accept one form of payment for his tea: silver. Every year, British merchants loaded ships with millions of ounces of pure silver bullion and sailed them to the port of Canton. They traded the silver for tea, and the ships returned to London. The silver never came back. It just vanished into the Chinese economy. By 1830, the trade deficit had become a crisis. Britain was exporting roughly 6 million pounds of silver annually to China. The reserves at the Bank of England were dropping. Currency stability was at risk. If the hemorrhage continued, the entire imperial economy would collapse under its own debt. The directors of the East India Company sat in their offices in London and faced a brutal truth. They needed a product the Chinese couldn't refuse. They needed something that would reverse the flow of silver and restore the balance sheet. They found it growing in the fields of Bengal. Opium, the poppy plant, had been cultivated in India for centuries, but the British turned it into an industrial operation. They forced tens of thousands of Indian farmers to abandon food crops and plant poppies instead. The colonial administration built processing factories in Patna and Gazipur that operated with the cold efficiency of modern pharmaceutical labs. Workers churned opium paste in massive vats, standardizing potency and packaging it into uniform balls. Each ball was stamped with the official seal of the East India Company. This was not black market narcotics. This was government-grade poison, produced with the same quality control standards the British applied to naval cannons. The genius of the system was its scale and its deniability. The East India Company didn't smuggle the opium themselves. That would have been too obvious. Instead, they sold it at public auctions in Calcutta to private merchants. These men were the runners, the dealers, the front men, and the most successful of them was a Scottish doctor named William Jardine. Jardine had the mind of a surgeon and the morals of a loan shark. He bought opium by the ton at government auctions, loaded it onto fast clipper ships armed with cannons, and sailed them to the coast of China. He anchored off remote islands and turned his ships into floating warehouses. Local gangs ferried the drug to shore in small boats. Chinese officials were bribed. Dealers were armed. A distribution network spread like a virus through the southern provinces, and the silver came flooding back. The trade deficit reversed. British merchants who had been paying the Qing emperor in silver were now collecting that same silver from Chinese addicts. The money flowed back to London. The balance sheet stabilized. The Bank of England breathed a sigh of relief. But the cost was the systematic destruction of Chinese society. By 1838, the British were moving 40,000 chests of opium into China every year. That's roughly 2.5 million kilograms of narcotic. Entire villages stopped working. Men lay on wooden pallets, smoking opium from dawn until dusk. The Chinese army was rotting from within because soldiers sold their weapons to buy the drug. Magistrates couldn't enforce laws because they were high in their offices. The silver that kept the Chinese economy functioning was vanishing. The Qing emperor watched his empire unravel and understood he was facing an existential crisis. If the opium kept flowing, China would cease to exist as a state. He appointed a scholar named Lin Zexu as imperial commissioner and gave him a single mandate: stop the poison. Lin Zexu arrived in Canton in March of 1839, and he came to wage war on the cartel. He arrested thousands of Chinese dealers and threw them in prison. He rounded up addicts and forced them into brutal rehabilitation programs. But Lin knew that arresting victims wouldn't solve the problem. He had to cut off the supply. He issued an ultimatum to the British merchants who lived in the foreign quarter of Canton. Surrender every ounce of opium in your possession and sign a bond promising never to traffic drugs again, or face execution. The British merchants stalled. Lin surrounded their compound with troops. He cut off food and water. He ordered drums beaten day and night to deprive them of sleep. He turned their luxury trading post into a prison. Captain Charles Elliot, the British superintendent, realized he had lost. Fearing for British lives, he ordered the merchants to hand over their stock. He promised them the British government would reimburse them for the loss. Lin seized over 20,000 chests. It was a mountain of drugs worth millions, and he destroyed it all. For 23 days, workers dug trenches on the beach at Hummun and dumped the opium inside. They mixed it with lime and salt until it turned to sludge, then flushed it into the ocean at low tide. While the poison boiled, Lin sat in his tent and wrote a letter to Queen Victoria. He addressed her as a fellow monarch, as a person of conscience. He asked her a simple question. If opium is banned in your own country, how can you allow it to poison mine? The letter never reached her, or if it did, she never replied. Because in London, the destruction of the opium was not seen as a righteous act of law enforcement. It was seen as theft. The drug dealers didn't hide in shame. They went on the offensive. William Jardine traveled to London and met with Foreign Secretary Lord Palmerston. He laid out maps of the Chinese coast. He pointed to defenseless ports and deep harbors. He argued that the Chinese had violated the sacred principle of free trade. He argued that the destruction of British property demanded retribution. He promised that a small fleet of modern warships could bring the Qing dynasty to its knees in weeks. Palmerston looked at the numbers. The British government was broke. They needed the tea tax. They needed the silver. And now they had a bill for £6 million from merchants who had lost their opium. The choice was simple. Respect Chinese law and accept the loss, or go to war and force China to pay for the drugs they had destroyed. They chose war. The fleet that sailed to China in 1840 was not just a military force. It was the Industrial Revolution weaponized for organized crime. At the head of the Armada was a ship called the Nemesis. It was the first ocean-going iron warship in history, powered by steam engines that allowed it to sail against the wind and navigate shallow rivers. To Chinese defenders watching from shore, it looked like a demon. Their navy consisted of wooden junks powered by oars and sails, armed with cannons that hadn't changed since the Ming Dynasty. The collision was not a battle. It was a massacre. British strategy was ruthless and efficient. They didn't try to conquer China's interior. They strangled it. They sailed up the coast, bombarding forts and seizing ports. They captured the grain barges that carried tax revenue to Beijing, threatening the capital with starvation. Chinese generals were brave. They had studied war for their entire lives, but they were fighting weapons they couldn't comprehend. Cannonballs bounced off the iron hull of the Nemesis. Wooden ships exploded under rocket fire. British officers watched Chinese soldiers stand their ground and fire outdated muskets until they were cut down by grape shot. It was medieval courage meeting industrial firepower, and industrial firepower had no mercy. As the British moved north, burning cities and shattering armies, the emperor in Beijing sat in paralyzed disbelief. He could not understand how a handful of foreigners from a distant island had dismantled the defenses of the Middle Kingdom. But the British didn't care about his confusion. They cared about his surrender. By the summer of 1842, British warships had sailed up the Yangtze River and trained their guns on the ancient city of Nanjing. They sent a message to the emperor: "Surrender or we burn the city." Faced with annihilation, the emperor capitulated. On August 29, 1842, Chinese officials boarded the British flagship HMS Cornwallis. Under the shadow of British cannons, they signed the Treaty of Nanking. The treaty is known in China as the first of the unequal treaties. It was a document of national humiliation. The terms were dictated by the victors and designed to strip China of economic sovereignty. The British demanded an indemnity of 21 million silver dollars. 6 million of those dollars were specifically designated to reimburse British merchants for the opium Lin Zexu had destroyed. Let that sink in. The British government forced China to pay for the drugs that had been smuggled into their country illegally. It was a protection racket on a global scale. But the money was only part of the price. The treaty forced China to open 5 treaty ports where British merchants could live and trade without being subject to Chinese law. And most fatefully, it forced the emperor to cede a barren island off the southern coast to Britain in perpetuity. That island was Hong Kong. Lord Palmerston was furious when he heard about Hong Kong. He called it a barren rock with hardly a house upon it. He had wanted a productive territory, not a desolate fishing village, but the drug smugglers knew exactly what they had won. Hong Kong was the perfect base of operations. Under the protection of the British flag, the opium traders could build warehouses and dock their ships without fear of Chinese police. Hong Kong became the nerve center of the cartel. It was the logistical hub from which poison flowed into the continent. In the years after the treaty, the opium trade didn't just resume, it exploded. Production in India ramped up to meet the demand of a broken China. By the 1880s, the British were selling over 6,000 tons of opium to China every year. The revenue from this trade became the financial backbone of British India. It paid for railways. It paid for the civil service. It paid for the Royal Navy. The Pax Britannica, the great era of British peace and prosperity, was underwritten by the addiction of millions of Chinese peasants. The psychological damage to China was even worse than the economic cost. The Opium Wars shattered the Chinese worldview. For thousands of years, they had seen themselves as the center of civilization, the apex of human achievement. Now they had been brought low by a nation of drug pushers. This trauma birthed what is known in China as the Century of Humiliation. It was a period of internal chaos, civil war, and foreign domination that lasted until the mid-20th century. It is the scar that defines modern China. When Chinese leaders today speak of national rejuvenation or warn against foreign interference, they are not speaking in abstract terms. They are remembering the smoking pits at Human. They are remembering the time the West came not with an open hand, but with a fist full of poison. Sovereignty is solvency. The Qing dynasty learned that lesson the hard way. They were not conquered by a superior army. They were foreclosed on by a superior economy. But what happened to the men who orchestrated this crime? What happened to William Jardine, the iron-headed old rat who built the cartel? Did he face justice for the misery he profited from? No. He returned to London a hero. He was elected to Parliament. His partner, James Matheson, became a baronet and one of the largest landowners in Britain. The company they founded, Jardine Matheson and Company, did not disappear into the shadows of history. It evolved. It moved from opium into shipping, real estate, and finance. It became one of the great trading houses that built modern Hong Kong. If you walk through the financial district of Hong Kong today, you will see the legacy of the drug trade written into the skyline. You will see Jardine House with its distinctive round windows overlooking the harbor that once teemed with opium clippers. You will see streets named after smugglers. The glittering prosperity of one of the world's great financial capitals is built on a foundation laid by a cartel. There is a bitter irony in the eventual fate of the opium trade. By the early 20th century, a moral crusade led by British religious groups finally gained enough political power to force the government to stop exporting opium to China. But they didn't stop because they suddenly found a conscience. They stopped because it was no longer necessary. The empire had found other ways to extract wealth, but the damage was permanent. The Opium Wars prove a simple truth that echoes through history. The line between a legitimate government and a criminal enterprise is often just a matter of who has the bigger navy. Free trade is a beautiful concept until it becomes a weapon wielded by the powerful against the weak. The portrait of Queen Victoria that hangs in the National Portrait Gallery shows a woman of dignity and moral authority. But the wealth that built her empire was stained with the blood and suffering of millions. The jewels in her crown were polished with silver drained from a dying nation. The tea in her cup was steeped in tragedy. The ghosts of the opium dens have not vanished. They linger in the suspicion that still divides East and West. They remind us that sovereignty is not a birthright. It is a privilege that can be taken away by anyone with a gunboat and a product to sell. History is not decided by kings or generals. It is decided by ledgers, by debt, by the flow of resources. The British Empire did not defeat China with superior courage or moral righteousness. They defeated China with superior cash flow and industrial capacity. They turned economic desperation into a weapon and dressed it up in the language of civilization and progress. And once you force a nation to swallow your poison, you can never expect them to trust you when you offer them medicine. This is the Cinematic History Tales channel, where we dig beneath the surface of the stories you think you know. Subscribe now so you can stay ahead of the curve, because when the history books are rewritten, you'll want to be among the few who saw the truth coming. Thanks for watching.